Welcome to Miami Children's Museum's Quarterly Conversation, our next rendition of our quarterly conversation. This is in fact our 7th one, an initiative born out of the pandemic, and one that we are continuing on and growing post-pandemic, if we can say that yet. Today's topic is fundamental friendships, the benefits of diverse friendship groups for children. My name is Brianna Obst, and I am the Associate Director of Theatre, Education, and Arts at Miami Children's Museum, and will be the moderator and host for today's session. We are going to jump straight on into panelists. So first up, we have Yarrow Dunham. He is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology, as well as the faculty in the Cognitive Science program at Yale. His research explores how people make sense of the complex social worlds they inhabit, and he's also a father of one, a young little 6-year-old. We also have Sarah Wright. She has her Master of Arts in Education from the University of California in Berkeley, and has received her Bachelor of Science in Human Ecology from Ohio State University. Sarah is the CEO of Goldie, LLC, specializing in diversity in education consulting. And finally, we are joined by Dr. Melanie Killen, Professor of Human Development and Quantitative Methodology, Professor of Psychology Affiliate, and the Director of the Social and Moral Development Lab at the University of Maryland. Dr. Killen studies the origins of prejudice in relationship to children's and adolescents' social cognition and moral reasoning and cross-group friendships. Now I got all the mouthful of information out about our lovely panelists. My opening question for our panelists is firstly just to define what we mean when we say cross-group friendships, diverse friendship groups. What does that mean by definition?
So I think I would suggest that we start with a pretty broad view of what this means, by which I mean to say we all belong to many different groups. We belong to groups that we might associate with, say, gender, with nationality, with the language we speak, with our race, with our ethnicity, with our religion. So there are lots of dimensions of diversity, lots of dimensions of groups. And so we can, I think, start by thinking of, say, when we talk about diverse or cross-group friendships, there's a very broad sense in which we can think about diversity and cross-group along many of these different dimensions. But obviously, some of these very same dimensions are maybe more socially central or more socially charged or more influential. So those of us who work in these areas tend to think a little bit more about, for example, race, ethnicity, religion, language, gender as sort of particularly important dimensions that we might think of as having a lot of social importance. The only very last thing I'd say is another thing that just complicates this whole discussion is that we all belong to many of those different groups at the same time. So a particular friendship can be cross-group along one dimension and not cross-group along another dimension. So say two boys who belong to different ethnic or racial groups. It's cross-group along race and ethnicity, but same group along gender. So those are just some of the background complexities I think it's worth us all thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Melanie or Sarah, do you have anything to add to that, or was Yarrow pretty spot on?
Well, of course, Yarrow's always spot on, but it's a big topic and we can all add more to it, of course. I mean, I think I would add that we call cross-group friendships. Why do we even have that term? We have that term there because most of the time kids are often gravitating towards kids who are sort of like them, and by some of these categories that we're talking about, like race or gender, ethnicity, nationality, and so forth. And so researchers, educators, parents, teachers are becoming aware and making a concerted effort to say we need to promote and facilitate cross-group friendships, that it's not the norm. And of course, it's true that we're members of many different groups, but there's particular groups where it's particularly a problem. gender segregation, racial segregation, ethnic segregation. Of course, the others too, but that's what we see a lot in the US. And we also have to recognize, we're a global science, a global world. So some of the things we'll talk about will be more US based, but there's also research in other places as well. But so we call this phenomenon cross-group friendships, which isn't a typical term that a parent or a teacher is going to use, but we're identifying it because there are problems when kids when they tend to be that sort of define their friendships by groups, by who looks like me or who sounds like me. They're losing this opportunity to be friends with other kids they might have a lot more in common with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Melanie. Sarah, did you want to add anything to the definition?
No, I think they pretty much have it covered. I think if you're someone that has smaller kids, you can kind of think of these cross groups as an iceberg. Like there's things that we can see that are above the water and things that we can't see. And so what we're speaking to are the things that we can see in ways that we can help the kids identify with other people.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, all of you. So the topic, as we said, of this quarterly conversation is the benefits of diverse or cross-group friendships for children. So I guess it's a two-part question. What are these benefits, and what aren't? Like, what's the detriment of the child who grows into an adult, who grows into a citizen of the world or the country? So I'd like to hear both the benefits and also the unbenefits, so to speak.
I can start at the baseline. I think
Sure.
one of the core benefits, just as someone who's always worked with like the youngest of the people as an elementary school teacher, is just empathy. Like at the end of the day, we want kids to be empathetic kids who grow up to be empathetic people. And as adults, I think when you have these cross groups from a very young age, you're more likely to think about like your intentions versus your impact, and be more thoughtful about the decisions that you're making, not being egocentric or self-driven in terms of like what's in the best interest of your core group, but you're thinking about what's in the best interest of everyone involved. And so I think that is one of the benefits of having it. And what's detrimental is what I think we see now, where like a lot of things do feel more charged and people are really upset about different things because it feels like people are only voting or doing things in the interest of their one group and not thinking about how it impacts everybody else.
Sure. Yarrow, go ahead.
Yeah, just to build on, I think that was, I think Sarah really hit on many of the things that I would have said as well. Just to build on that, there is a really interesting, I think, research base, just kind of validating a lot of those points. And in particular, there's interesting research suggesting if you want to know about one's degree of cross-group empathy or prejudice as an adult, one of the predictors of that is what was your friendship structure like as a child? So children who grow up with more diverse friendship structures tend to grow up to be less biased, less prejudiced adults. And I think it has a lot to do with the factors that Sarah mentioned, things like empathy and just general comfort. Unfortunately, one thing that happens if we grow up uncomfortable with those kinds of interactions, we might interpret our own discomfort as evidence that there's something wrong with the other group, and that can feed into forms of prejudice, right? And so those early experiences in many ways, I think, really lay a foundation for growing up as someone who sort of is comfortable with and therefore can more easily see beyond those kind of group distinctions.
Thank you. Melanie.
Yeah, I completely agree with all that's been said. And I would add to it that a benefit is also the ability to challenge stereotypes when you see them. So, a white child and a Latinx child who are really close friends is important for the empathy and perspective taking, but also when the white child goes to a movie and sees a really bad stereotype about a Latinx boy, or is on the playground and hears somebody say, well, you're just from Mexico, why are you here? You can challenge it, and challenging stereotypes is part of sort of rectifying inequalities. So the child can say, well, my friend's not like that. Why are they saying that? My friend's not from Mexico. Or in the movie, my friend's father's really nice. He's not like a bad guy. Why are they doing that? So it gives you that personal experience to challenge stereotypes. And that is very fundamental and very important for development, because we can teach children things, but they need to have their personal experiences. And that's a lot of what we think has been shown to be so important about cross-group friendships, is it's that personal experience you have to understand both diversity of individuals and other groups, but also that ability to challenge it when you hear a stereotype, when you hear something, or you watch unfair treatment.
Great. And what I think is great that was mentioned is that there is, research. Obviously, both Yarrow and Melanie, you're in the research academia field, right? So there's research to support these findings, right?
A lot. It's a very big area now.
Yeah, I can imagine so. Through what we as a country and as a world have been through, right, in the last I would say 3-4 years in particular. So we've talked about why it's a benefit and why it's a detriment. So how do we do this? And I want to remind our panelists, right, here in the conversation, we have parents, we have educators, and we have museum staff, so formal and informal educators here. So how do we best encourage or reinforce these benefits for the cross-group friendships in the classroom, in the museum, in our homes? How do we do this?
Yeah, there's a number of different ways to really facilitate this. And what we try to do is talk to teachers and parents about helping to facilitate these kinds of cross-group friendships. If, for parents just to say, oh, you should be friends with someone who looks different from you, or you should do this, is not very effective. And kids start to wonder, well, why? Was there something wrong here? But if you can set up groups, and part of it also, which is, I saw that was part of something else that you had mentioned earlier, but part of it is also parents and teachers demonstrating this for themselves. So of course that's can be challenging for some people, but demonstrating that. And sometimes I give the example of just even like at the bus stop. I remember when I used to go to the bus stop when my kids were little, long time ago, and the bus stop was diverse by ethnicity and race, but when I first got there, I saw the parents kind of like self-segregating by ethnicity, and I was just dumbfounded, and I'd sort of like go over and sort of start making sure I was talking to other parents, because it's sometimes, unfortunately, it's that comfort level that both Yarrow and Sarah talked about. There's this sort of unfortunate sense that someone who looks like you're going to have more in common with, which is just a falsity. I mean, there's just nothing about that makes it true. I mean, there's tradition sometimes, and when we get into religion, nationality, but for a lot of these categories, there's no basis for it. So the idea is being a role model yourself, but also then really encouraging kids and giving them opportunities to make those inferences. Another example I'll give you is that sometimes we find that when parents have an opportunity to look at books and teach children through talking about books and sharing books, they'll pick books that reflect their own ethnicity or gender, thinking that, well, they shouldn't tell stories to their kids about other groups. But no, that's exactly the opposite. They should do that. So facilitating children's awareness of friendships through promoting it, but not directly teaching it, providing, peer groups, play groups, reading books that have kids from different ethnic groups together.
Yeah, and we talk a lot here at Miami Children's Museum about just diversifying your bookshelves, right? And that's a key thing to bring that diversity into the home. Sarah or Yarrow, do you want to add to how do we do this? How do we make these groups cross-group friendships? Sarah.
Yeah, sure. One of the things I would add is that, like, maybe even taking it a step back is not assuming that your child knows how to even make a friend, especially coming out of COVID. That was one of the things that I noticed when I went back into the schools, was that students were having a really hard time with, like, how do I engage in play? If I'm standing next to them, why don't they know I want to play soccer with them? And so, like, sometimes like we're thinking like 5 steps ahead, and our child may just need help with like, how do I let someone know that I want to play with them? Like, am I able to read people's social cues? Am I taking something personally that maybe I could have let go of? So I would think about that too as a baseline. And then like in terms of our own comfort level as adults, like a lot of times as kids, they're going to make friends with the people that we have friends with. And a lot of times the people that we have play dates with are the people we feel the most comfortable with. So I'm like, I know Bree, so I'm going to call Bree to see if Bree wants to hang out with me and my child. But we could also think about like, what libraries are we going to? Are we only going to the libraries in our neighborhood? Maybe I could venture out and go to another library if I have access to the transportation to do so. Am I always shopping in the same place? So that way, when we are going to other places to meet new people, it's not from this place that can create saviorism, especially if you're thinking about like social economic status and class, or I know someone that asked about like abilities and things like that. I think it's very important that we're thinking about all the ways in which we're engaging with people.
Yeah,
That's great. And so, sorry, I was just going to say, Yarrow, super interesting about how do you be a friend? Like how, and definitely what was either forgotten or not naturally taught during the pandemic and the shutdown. So yeah, poor little ones. Yarrow, go for it.
Yeah, really just to kind of expand on some of the ideas that I think both Sarah and Melanie mentioned, which is that I think it's a mistake to think about this as something we're doing solely for our children and not something we're doing in our own lives as well. And one of the fundamental ways I think about children as a developmental scientist is they're sort of like little intuitive sociologists or social scientists. They're looking at the world around them, trying to understand, what am I supposed to do? What am I not supposed to do? And so in Melanie's example of being at the bus stop, our kids are going to, your kid is going to notice if you don't cross lines of difference to talk to other people. And unfortunately, even if we're just doing it out of habit, out of comfort, they may interpret something a little richer from that. They may interpret, I guess my parent maybe doesn't want me to do that either. They may actually take something a little more powerful from it. And there's been really interesting research suggesting that kids have varying ideas about whether their parents want them to make cross-group friendships. So one thing to say is just kids have an idea about that. They have a belief about whether their parent wants them to or not. And those beliefs matter for the development of their own prejudice and also just for their own choices and their own behavior. So even though it's a challenge, depending on the environment you're in, and especially if you're in a homogeneous environment, this is obviously more challenging. The kinds of ideas that people mention, like, how can you make changes into the structure of your own life that do two things, that actually expose your whole family to more of that diversity, but also that signal to your children that this is a valuable thing. And it's also not such a big deal. It's not so scary, et cetera. So I think those are, I really think that I think of this as a parent myself, right? This is a responsibility I feel like I have to take on as a white parent of a monoracial white child. Like this is something that I have to do. I have to create those structures, not just in her life, but in my life as well.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, we did a study where we had kids looking at pictures of children their age, but one was white, one was black, and we were asking them about, could they be friends? Would their friends want them to be friends? Would their parents want them to be friends? And what we found starting at 6 years of age, going up to about 10 years of age, is that a lot of times the kids said they'd want to be friends with them, but they would say, but my mom or my dad wouldn't want me to. And that was true even for kids from different ethnic backgrounds. I mean, it was more so often for the white kids, but it was also true for African-American kids, the Latinx kids, the Asian kids. We had a very diverse sample. And we actually presented on one opportunity we had, we presented some of these findings to the parents. And it wasn't one-to-one whose kids said this, but we said to them that we found that kids would say things like, well, my mom wouldn't want me to invite them home because they think they're different or something. The parents were really surprised. So it's sort of like what Yarrow was saying. The parents were very surprised, like, what? Well, it couldn't be my kid. I mean, we happen to know that oftentimes it was their kid, but of course we didn't say that specifically. But we said the majority of the kids said this, and they said, wow. And some of them actually said, this is a wake-up call. I really didn't realize this. I didn't realize I wonder what I'm doing. Like, sort of like, again, I wonder what I'm doing. Well, maybe if you're at the bus stop and you're not talking to their parents, but things you say in the home, kids are just like, big antennas on. They're picking up everything, even when it doesn't seem like it. And, even sometimes I see parents in a play group or play date, and they'll say, sort of start whispering a little, and like the kids are right there. They hear it. And so you have to be very mindful of that. And for these kinds of things, it's very easy for adults to sort of be sending a lot of explicit and implicit messages about who you should interact with. The fact that these kids were saying it at such a young age was really, hopefully it was a wake-up call for the parents, but we also have to do our job, as we're doing now, I suppose, to make it very real to parents, teachers, educators, museum workers, that these are issues that we really have to address front on. It's really important, and there's a lot of plus and benefits to it. We can talk about more later, but for this process to evolve.
Yarrow, I know when we spoke last week, you mentioned about parental anxiety and the kids picking it, which is exactly sort of what we're talking about. And sometimes we could talk about unconscious biases all day, right? And so do you want to just touch a little bit on that kind of adult anxiety that we spoke about?
I think it's very related. Yeah, so this is a good point to talk about that a little bit. And one thing that we now know, but we know both from, I think, our own personal experiences, but also now from a lot of research, is that some parents, and if we're talking about the domain of race, in particular white parents, are often uncomfortable talking about race and racial issues, even with their own children. And they maybe do so because they don't know how to address it, or of course, it can be a weighty, difficult, challenging topic. But unfortunately, sort of like some of those other examples, that unease or anxiety might get interpreted by the child as something different, right? As this is a taboo topic, or as I shouldn't ask or think about these things. And of course, young children are going to notice things in the world, and they're going to ask questions. And a kind of an anecdote that I hear from parents who participate in my research quite frequently is something like a white parent and their child is, say, walking through the supermarket, and their child notices, say, the skin color of someone else, and might point it out, like, "Mommy, why is that person, why is that person's skin so dark?" or something like that. And a parent might, if a parent just responds with nothing but nervous and "Shh, let's not talk about that. Come away. That's sending messages, right? I think we can all maybe sympathize with that reaction. If the kid is, the loud kid voice saying something embarrassing, we all know this has happened to all of us who are parents. But in this kind of context, there's a worry. What is being signaled to that child about that response? And so those are just ways in which that parental anxiety can get can get amplified and perhaps interpreted in some other way by a parent. And one of the things I often tell parents about these kinds of cases is at some point your child is going to ask these kinds of questions. So you can actually think a little bit in advance. You can actually have a kind of a canned response, like, well, what will I say when I get these kinds of questions? And that way you're not so taken aback, and you can, and probably we can pretty easily as educators and parents think about better ways, maybe not the ideal way, but much better ways to say this, that people, oh yeah, people are different in all these different ways. And like, you have this color hair and this color eyes and this color skin. And, we all have these things that are different about us. And those are ways to just make that part of the normal fabric of human variation rather than this particularly charged or dangerous topic. So I think those are just things to think about a little bit, and as parents to anticipate and maybe be a little prepared for.
Mm-hmm. Sarah.
I would just add, like, if you're not thinking through how do you want to have these conversations with your child, then sometimes the first time they hear, like if we use the example race, the first time they may learn about what whiteness is in the context of MLK, going to school in kindergarten, and then you think that all white people oppressed all Black people, right? And so I think being as intentional as you can be, even for us as educators and you fellow educators out there, how do we want to first introduce the topic of race? When I taught 12th graders, some of them have said they never even learned about whiteness. They learned about other topics, and it was assumed that they knew what whiteness was because they were white students, but they didn't really learn about the historical context of whiteness. How has that had an impact on other different race and race as a social construct and all that stuff. And so I would think about that. I would also say I definitely can empathize as a Black woman in America, how you could have anxiety around having cross friends groups, you know, like it can be exhausting if you're like one of a few in a circle and you're like, are they going to ask me about my hair? Am I going to have to explain this? And I think that's part of the reason why in the older groups, when kids get to like middle school and high school, they're just like, I'm just going to find other people that I know visibly look like me, so I don't have to explain myself, or the assumption for them is that it'll just be understood, but we know that that may not be the case because we don't all have homogenous experiences, regardless of what our identities are. And so I think it's like practicing, and also if you are feeling really nervous and you don't have an answer in the moment, you can parking lot it. Like you can wait. You can say like, you know what, this is a great question, or I see you're very curious about this. Let me think about it, and we're going to come back to it. And you can do that as a parent. You can do that as an educator. You can do that as a museum personnel. Let someone ask you a question and be prepared for the next time someone asks you that.
Great, thank you. So I have a question that was part of from one of our registrants. And it's, how do you build a child's self-esteem? And maybe Sarah, goes to what you're talking about, right? Like not necessarily wanting to be constantly asked about how you do your hair, or, you know, like you were saying, but how do you build child self-esteem about our own appearance without drawing like a negative comparison between others' appearances?
The picture book world has grown a lot. I think there's a lot more resources out there for parents. I think it's okay to just state things like, your hair looks so pretty. It doesn't have to be in contrast to someone else's hair or skin tone or texture or anything that they do. I think affirmations are really good. It builds confidence. And just reminding ourselves that like kids are very curious, as Yarrow was saying, and that they're trying to categorize the world just in the way that we do like shapes and numbers. And so like, I think one of the things I always have to remind myself as an adult is not to add stuff onto their curiosity when they're like, oh, that has 4 sides, it must be a square. And I'm like, oh, are you thinking something bad about triangles? Like they're not even there a lot of the times, you know? And so I think just reminding yourself of that it's okay to point out the good in what you see in your child.
Yeah, Melanie.
Yeah, I think something that we should also be talking directly about is that cross-group friendships may work differently for people who are the sort of majority status group, white kids and adults, and the minority status group, ethnic minority or sexual identity minority, and so forth. That I think what Sarah said is very, very important, and we want to be mindful of that it works. It's going to work a little differently, and the research shows that. So when we say cross-group friendships are important and good for all children, promote diversity, that's true, but it's also true that it works in different ways, and that there might be times, for example, where there's been research on this, where say ethnic minority adolescents talk about how they need both, because they need the time where they're just with kids like them. They said, yeah, I don't share the same music interests as a Black adolescent, one of our studies. I don't share the same music interests as my other Black friends, but at least when I'm with them, I know I'm not going to be treated differently because of my skin color. At least it's a time when I can just like let down and not have that happen. At the same time, I also have a lot of friends of different races and ethnicity, because like I like jazz, and my Asian friend likes jazz, and my Black friends don't like jazz, or that they'll talk about that. And I think that's really important, particularly by adolescents. I think that's when, because there are these studies saying that when you look at a school at the lunchtime and you always see kids self-segregating, and I sort of sometimes have trouble with the interpretation of that, because it's sort of like, hey, that's just the way it is. They self-segregate and they do it. And so why are we trying to force something? Well, we did a study where we interviewed kids very much in depth about all this, and we found that that's what they said. They'd say, well, for here, it's lunchtime. This is what I just have that comfort level of, just like, especially minority kids were saying this more than the white kids were saying, I need this time, but I also really need to integrate, and I like integrating, and I have a lot of things in common with my other friends, and we do things, but there's this one time a day where I have this. So that whole issue, I think, is more complex, and it's often been given credit, and particularly from, the kids from different ethnicities. So we have to think about, how do we start that early with the young kids? Because it's very clear the adolescents tell us explicitly that they have friends, they do both. So we have to think about what that means for young kids. I mean, in a way, you know, if we could have young kids really integrate early, maybe we wouldn't be in the situation where adolescents feel that they need that downtime, right? Eventually, we'd want to be at a point where society isn't creating that need, but it's going to be a long time to get there. So we have to think about, you know, what this means for young kids. And, you know, we have some ways of doing this, but I'll let other people jump in.
So we've talked a lot in terms of diversity with race and gender lines. What about the diversity in terms of disabilities? So we had a question saying, how can you encourage school systems, so we're going big here, to become more inclusive as related to forming relationships with children who have a cognitive, intellectual, or physical disability?
Well, two things. One, I think it is a really big question because not all teachers are trained the same way. And I could just speak from my own experience. Like I didn't even really fully grasp how to read a psychoeducational evaluation until I was at a school where that was a part of the admissions process. So just to like, for anyone that's out there that's trying to figure out the school, like teachers are coming in at a very different place. And then secondly, I think like being involved, like the board members and your principals and all of that, they're going to push the initiatives that they hear about the most. And so if that's something that you would like to see happen in your school setting, I think really bringing it up more. I will say like schools have come a long way and kids are mixed in, but parents feel different ways about like, my kid is dyslexic. Do I want everyone to know that my kid is dyslexic? Does the kid want everyone to know that they are? And so I didn't really answer the question, but more so trying to help you, I guess, get a sense of the landscape that you're talking about too.
Sure. And Melanie?
Yeah, it's a very big topic and we get this a lot and really important because, you know, there are all different kinds of people out there and all different kinds of kids. And when it comes to the schools, we've noticed that more schools are trying to do more integration. And we really support that because it's not that different from some of these other group memberships that, you know, when a kid can look at somebody who, let's say, has a physical disability, look at them and think they're another creature, they're another species, they're different from me. But, you know, they become friends with them, they find out that they both really like Star Wars, or they both really like, you know, Harry Potter, you know, whatever it is, that there's something that they really share, and that creates that friendship. And then it creates all the things we talked about earlier, the empathy, the perspective taking, that because it's just so easy for kids, as Sarah and Yarrow both mentioned about categorization. They're kind of categorizing the world, and they're going to use sometimes some very sort of basic criteria for categorizing that we know needs to be revved up. It needs to be more psychologically based than just physical appearance based. And so, you know, we do have to do a lot to do that. And there are school districts now that have really been pretty successful at trying to integrate for these kinds of reasons. And we find people have asked us, does it generalize from one group to another? Like if you have a school where they're really trying to integrate in terms of physical disability or social disability, does that help in terms of, say, race or ethnicity? And we think it does. I mean, that's just emerging science on that. It's not, I don't think it's a really robust area yet because it's very complex to try to document, you know, generalizability from one type of integrative group to another. But it seems like it isn't, kind of intuitively, it seems like it would make sense that we know it does from gender to race, but to physical and social disability, I don't know yet, but it would make sense that it would, because it's same kind of processes involved, you know, looking at somebody as somebody of a member of an out group, but then becoming friends with them and recognizing that they share a lot.
Yarrow, did you want to add to that?
Maybe just very quickly, I guess this is another place to talk about this issue that's come up at a few points, which is that your situation as a parent or educator is different if you are in an environment where these dimensions of diversity are already there around you in the school, for example, with disability, through, say, an inclusive or mainstreaming policy, similarly with race, similarly with other dimensions of diversity. And that really just calls attention to the broader structural issues that are here, right? I mean, there's a recent move in psychology in my field to just remind us that while we think about all these things as only existing inside our heads, they also manifest in these broader structures. If you have no opportunities to interact with people across different kinds of group boundaries, it's going to be a lot harder to follow a lot of the recommendations that we're making here. And I guess just to stitch back to something that came up right at the beginning, there are known benefits of more indirect forms of exposure through things like children's books, through talking to people who have friends across those boundaries. So, so it's not, it's not as good probably as that direct experience that Melanie was emphasizing earlier, but it is something that all of us can do, right? We can find different sources of media that are going to give positive exemplars, and in some cases, exemplars of, say, disability or other forms of difference, where that's not the whole point of the story. It's just a character in the story going about their life. So it doesn't have to be this like bright spotlight. Kids are noticing, they are tracking these things, and that too, I think in some ways can be even more beneficial because it's not as sort of preachy, right? Coming back to another idea right from the beginning, don't do this or make friends across group boundaries. Rather, it's just setting norms that, oh, this is a perfectly normal thing to do, to have friends across these different forms of group boundary.
Well, I like, Melanie, as you were mentioning earlier, right? You had the bus stop example or the shopping example, right? So if you're a parent who doesn't necessarily have a diverse friendship group, you can go to places. I was just thinking about like, explore the playgrounds beyond your area, and it doesn't have to be a thing that we're saying to the kids like, hey kids, I'm going to take you to a playground where you're going to meet people of different colors and so forth, but more of just like, let's go check this one out. I heard it's got a cool slide, and then other things would, evolve from that if you're like, doing a little tour of playgrounds. I find that very exciting, but going to different places, shopping in different neighborhoods, and so forth is a good tip, a tangible tip for parents who don't necessarily have a diverse friendship group for themselves. Yes, Melanie.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, because I often get this question from parents. I'm a white parent, I live in a white community, what can I do about this? And it's like, race is not the only, skin color even, it's not the only criteria that creates in-group, out-group. Every community has in-group, out-group. Race is very salient, obviously, but there's also religion, and there's gender, sexuality, and there's nationality and immigrant status, and we're all members of multiple groups. And so I say, well, what's going on? What are the conflicts in your high school? And then they'll tell me, well, it is maybe religion, or it's something else, or it's immigrants who've come in, the Syrian immigrants or something. And it's like, okay, so talk about that. There are ways to talk about these other kinds of conflicts that will help to generalize. And then at the same time, you still would want to do the other things, I think, that we've been talking about, books and movies, and just exploring other areas, and traveling. Of course, as Sarah mentioned earlier, that depends often on your socioeconomic status, but still, if you have the opportunity to be able to travel somewhere, or even another city, go other places, that's very, very helpful. But I think we also have to recognize that there's a lot of work we have to do in all these issues, and doing the work, even when it's not maybe the most salient category, is still important work. Or even gender. I mean, girls and boys. There's still an incredible amount of stereotyping that goes on with just boys and girls, starting in preschool. Teachers who've told us we're very egalitarian. And then they went to open house as one example. The kids are coming in, the teachers are taking all the girls to dollhouse, and they were taking all the boys to the truck area. And it was like, and then so the kids started playing differently, and it's like, wait, hold on, time out. This is not egalitarian, because it's obviously segregating from the beginning. And so there's work to do there. And so I think just stepping back and trying to look at all the ways in which you're sending messages and things you're doing can be helpful. And that would be an example of what you could be working on, even if you're not in a ethnically homogeneous community. You still need to work on that in the ways we've talked about, but at the same time, you can do the work on, say, gender or other kinds of group memberships.
I was just thinking about my son's school has a hair policy for boys that is about the hair length, and his hair has gotten quite long, and it's past the shoulders. And he's like, I'm going to get told to cut it soon. And I'm like, well, what's the hair policy for girls? I'm like,
Right.
And he's like, they can have it. I'm like, the day they tell you to cut it, let's talk.
Or you can go and talk to the principal.
Oh, yeah. Yep. It will be happening. So we've been talking a lot from parents' perspective. We touched a little on like, education in terms of like broader kind of policy in education, I guess. What about for our, grassroots teachers, also, our museum educators? We have a lot of people from children's museums across the country here joining us, who are making public programs. How do they encourage these diverse friendship groups in their curriculum, both the informal of the museum world and the more formal of the school education world?
I mean, even simple things like if you have a lot of kids coming together to do activities, we know that putting people into groups that are themselves diverse and not making a point of that at all, just having them work on something together, is actually one of the kind of tried and true classic psychological manipulations to reduce intergroup tensions and kind of negative feelings. So if you're together and you're all kind of equal and you're working towards a shared goal, so that can be a science, it can be solving, doing some science museum stuff, or doing some games in a children's museum, or whatever that is. And that might mean little simple things like assigning, like randomly creating the groups rather than let children form groups themselves for the reasons we've talked about, right? That the group that might most naturally form, or kids might be initially most comfortable with, might be a little bit more homogenous, for example. So those are, I think, some of the things to do. And then, of course, other ones that interact with a bigger structural issues, like can you lower barriers to entry to your space and to your museum? My lab does research at a big science museum in Connecticut, the Connecticut Science Center. And about once or twice a month, they have free or reduced admission days. And it's just sort of a fact that when we're there testing on those days, the participants, the children, the families that are there are just much more diverse, because it doesn't cost $20 a person to come into the museum. And the intersection of some of the categories or some of the groups we're talking about and economic disparities is, something we can't ignore or gloss over. So the more you can create those opportunities within that context, where it's is another way, I think, to move in that direction. None of these are kind of silver bullets, but I think those are some ways to help get in that direction.
Well, Yara, I really like the point of like the shared goal. I think sometimes often in programming from a museum perspective, we want, a little take home. So they do something to take home. They made this at the museum, whether it's an art thing or a science thing that they did themselves, but something that's more of a collective goal, that when you sit down at the table to do this at a children's museum, you don't know anybody really. You came with your parents or the nanny or the grandparents, whoever. I like that little nugget of thinking about.
It's really fun. It's really engaging,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Sarah.
Yeah, I would love to build on from that. I love like what he was talking about in terms of like the shared goals. I think thinking about like your policies, practices, and procedures that you have. So at the last school I was at, for elementary school, they didn't pick where they were sitting at lunch. Like we always picked, and we always mixed up the groups. So like they knew like I'm gonna sit with some random other second grader that I may or may not know for about 2 weeks, and then the groups would switch up. And that really helped us in terms of like our school was very homogenous. We were trying to be more diverse. We were probably like 33% student of color, but like a lot of our differences were across like social economic status and how they were going to integrate with parties. And so we did a lot of education around like, okay, is the expectation that when you invite someone to a party, they have to bring a gift? And how does that, how can we lower the entry, right? So like people wanting to select yes, if I don't have to worry about a gift, and what is the impact of that? And so thinking about those things. And then I think like, I love a good project that you can like, we finished it, that's great, look at this, it's really great. But like, how do you build on those projects? And so like, if you have a project where kids are looking at intersectionality, because you could do that in 5th grade. Like by 5th grade, there's so many studies that like they know the stereotypes, they are enforcing the stereotypes by 5th grade. They've seen what is out there in the world. And so like you could do a lot of stuff about like identity and intersecting identities, and then use the books that you use in class. Like if you're reading the book Wonder, like what are the parts of the main character identity, and how is that impacting how people are interacting with him, and how does that impact how he's interacting with the other characters in the book? Or if there's a book called Front Desk, and it's about like an Asian American immigrant that immigrants over here for the first time, and everything that's happening in the 90s with like the racial structures in California. It was a great book to talk about like all the different characters' identities and how there was two different Asian characters. One had money, one didn't. And how did that impact how the other students were interacting with them? So we did a fun project in the beginning. We made our little flower that had different colors based on our identity, but then we built on that. And so I think that would be the big takeaway is like, if you're an educator or in the education department at a museum, like how can you change your one and done to like building on as a stepping stone to something else? Because I think art is a great way to like a low entry point. People tend to let their guards down when they're doing an art project.
Melanie.
Yeah, I think also I would really recommend going along with both that Yarrow and Sarah said, you know, sort of like having museum educators kind of reassess their own assumptions. You know, it's really important. We fall back on the same things, doing the same things, our traditions. And I think of museums, you know, so often sometimes I see like dinosaurs are for boys and butterflies are for girls. And, you know, and then when I used to take my kids to museums for like the special activities on Saturday morning, and fortunately in DC, they're all free. So we have that access, but still, it was like, there still were some of those assumptions going on. There was still sort of like, the boys are going to like the rocks and the gems and dinosaurs, and the girls are going to like, you know, these other things. And it's like, why? You know, let's sort of re-examine that. And also the same thing, like looking at all your materials really closely. I think we've made a lot of progress in that in the US and museums, but still, I mean, I've been amazed at some of my own colleagues, you know, they're coming to give a talk about issues of diversity. And I look at the slides or PowerPoint slides and they're all white kids. And it's like, I've said to them afterwards, come on, you know, you don't even see that. It's like, we need to mix this up. I mean, we're not all white. Particularly by 2044. But, you know, I mean, we need to like, it's just a thing that people just somehow don't see, especially in the who are in the majority group. And so we need that. When I've been in museums, I feel museums are very aware of a lot of this, and have been doing an excellent job at, you know, making it more diverse. But still, we need to sort of encourage everyone to re-examine that. Look at your exhibits, look at your activities. Are you doing the kinds of things Sarah suggested and Yarrow suggested, and just re-examining how it's been done before? It's time to make changes, really dramatic changes in how we represent who we are, how we think about what the interests are going to be of young children. There are all kinds of interests and ways of doing things and ways of looking. And we just have to really change that. And museums can be at the forefront, you know, they can be at the forefront for this. And that would be very exciting, you know, to see that.
And Sarah, earlier you sort of mentioned talking about the disabilities, you know, the decision makers, your sort of board members, if you are diversifying that, right, people will push for what their interest is, or a box that maybe they check off, right? So, I always think, because like I'm from a theater background, I'm always going to push the arts, right? But that's not the one and only area. So I think about in terms of museums and school boards and decision makers, you know, you diversify your board across, you know, gender, race, abilities, religion, and so forth. People are going to advocate for their interests and their areas that speak to them. And so, you know, in turn, hopefully that then filters down into the programming, the teachers, and so forth. I just wanted to sort of touch on that point that you had mentioned earlier, Sarah, with that. Anybody else on sort of museum and education, school world? I think, Melanie, you mentioned, you know, also about your staff, right? In the museum world, a lot of our educators, our frontline staff are, well, at least here at Miami Children's Museum, are younger, just college students and so forth. So it's, you know, we need to talk about teaching us to check our own biases. You know, I was just thinking this morning, I went for a run and thinking about today's conversation and everything. And I was like, who do I say hi to on my run? like when I pass people, and I was just checking myself, who do I naturally say, hi, morning, morning, morning? And that was something that sort of came up earlier for parents, right? Who do you talk to naturally? But, you know, even if we're not parents and we're working in this educational setting, think about that. Who do you naturally talk to and greet when you're out and about? Like, check yourselves. And how do we as managers and directors and educators teach our staff, you know, how to do that and bring in, you know, our museum policies right through to the ground floor. I was wondering, you know, what are some barriers we face to diversifying, you know, children's friendship groups, or that you have either personally experienced or witnessed? What are obstacles, or what do you do in a situation where you're trying to diversify for your children or for your museum, and you're hitting a wall? What do we do, or what are some of these barriers that you have heard about or experienced?
I would build on what she was talking about in terms of like radical transformation. I think one of the barriers that I hear is that like, I just can't find diversity or things like that. But then we're like marketing in the same places, and we know that our cost is really high, but we're not doing anything to offset that or finding ways to partner with different programming. So I think that's one of them. But I think the other one might be ourselves as adults. I think might be the biggest barrier. I feel like kids nowadays are like so far beyond us sometimes. Like they're starting conversations saying like, hi, my name is Sarah, my pronouns are she, her, or they, them, there, and they know all the pronouns, and we're like, oh, what's the pronoun? And so I think like starting with ourselves, like we can't only put the onus for our world to be transformational on the youth. Like we have to do some of this work ourselves as adults. And I think that would help, like in the same way, like the board helps direct the direction of a museum. The same, we do that in our own houses with our own kids. Like we have to do the work too. So
Yeah.
I think also to add to that is that especially, you know, white parents or educators really have to persevere and have to be very, very persistent and very vigilant and just keep at it, because there's a lot of reasons why people of color might not want to be our best friend. You know, because they've had their own experiences that haven't always been positive. And I know like one of my colleagues is white, and she said, you know, I reached out to this other, you know, faculty member in another department, another university. You know, I want to have lunch with her, and she said she just didn't want to have lunch, and she wasn't comfortable, and and she started wanting to make sort of like generalizations. You know, I guess it's just the way it is. You know, we're just all going to be different. It's like, no, don't just use one example. I mean, there's all different kinds of people out there, number one. And number two, you're going to have to do a little extra work. You know, you're going to have to try again later, or, you know, find some way to make a connection or a contact, or, you know, there's that's sort of part of what I think Sarah's saying, the obstacles within ourselves. But we, you know, there's a different kind of burden for some of this, for some people than other people. And, you know, we need to do that. And it's not to say, I mean, I do believe we really want to have, you know, all kids, you know, be part of this diversity effort. But at the same time, we have to know that we have to keep at it, and you can't let up, and you can't say, well, I had this one experience and it wasn't good, so I'm just not going to try. What's the point? That's just not helpful in any way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yarrow, do you want to add to anything before we wrap up?
Maybe just really quickly to amplifying those last couple of points. Not every interaction we have in any, whether it's within group or cross group, goes super, super well. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Sometimes we don't make friends with someone. And, you know, hearkening back to something Sarah said earlier, there are differences across some of the groups we're talking about that don't always mean every interaction is going to go super, super smoothly. But I think what Melanie also just said is really important, that there's a tendency when something doesn't go well in a cross group context. If it's a within group context, you just go, oh, I guess, yeah, that just didn't work out. If it's a cross group context, it's easy to be like, oh, it's because of the group. And that's something we have to be on guard. That's, you know, that may be true, but it may well not be. It might just be you two individuals didn't connect in that moment. So the kind of the idea of sticking with it, right, of persevering and continuing to create these opportunities, and accepting that not every single interaction is going to be your favorite, is going to be the best. And just kind of, and that's true independent of who you're interacting with and what groups they do or don't belong to.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. So before we wrap up, are there any parting words of wisdom or final comments from anybody? I think we've covered a lot, and I think it's such a huge topic and dense topic that we could do this every week probably. Yeah, go ahead, Melanie.
Sarah?
I was just going to say it's okay to make mistakes. Like when you're doing all of this, you're going to make mistakes. That's okay. Like, to your point, persevere, keep trying again.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that a source of inspiration for me often is young children, because young children don't have all the sort of the biases yet, fortunately. And the thing about young children that you notice is they love diversity. They always want to play with kids who are all different. They're fascinated by children, and especially somebody's a little bit older than them. And you go to the park and they just love that. And they, we just have to figure out how to, continue that and sort of harness that energy, that beauty that we see with young kids, where they just love to be with other kids. Parents are boring, but kids are really fun, and sort of somehow or another just harness that more. And that could be in the museum context for sure.
Well, thank you all very, very much for joining us. A big thank you to Sarah, Melanie, and Yarrow for joining us. Of course, our ASL interpreters, thank you for being with us today, and continue the conversation, right? It doesn't end here. We persevere, we keep going, and we take what we've heard, what we've learned, and we continue this conversation. So on behalf of Miami Children's Museum, thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next quarter. Thank you all very much.